Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's AppSec Secrets. It's a virtual webinar series brought to you by SciCode. This series brings security, AppSec, DevSecOps, and even DevOps leaders together so we can flip the script on application security to discuss what really matters. Our goal for this series is to share best practices, challenges, research, threat intel, everything you need to keep it real. I am Julie Peterson, and I am your host today. I'm super excited to be here and speak with James and Jamie. Apparently, you need a J in your name to join this show today. And I would love to just briefly get some introductions done. Jamie, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Julie. I'm Jamie Sadler. I'm currently serving as the head of application security at theScore Gaming and Media.
Great. And James?
Yep, I'm James. I'm a security engineer at PagerDuty and also have a side project I started called Latio.tech.
Great. And you want to just tell a little bit about Latio and what that does?
Yeah, so we have created just a really accessible resource to learn application and cloud security, as well as find vendors and hopefully get quick little tidbits of who you should be looking for when you think about the million different Gartner acronyms that exist out there. Just trying to help provide some guidance to people so they don't miss anyone.
Yeah, we love a little acronym here in tech, so that's a great resource. Just some housekeeping things to go over as usual. We have a chat box. You can certainly put some comments in there. We also have a nice question area here. So if you have any questions that come up along the way, please feel free to type them into this box and we will answer them the best we can. If for some reason we can't answer your specific question due to time constraints, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. So before we get into this great conversation with James and Jamie, I just want to talk a little bit about some exciting news we have here at SciCode. And I'm going to share actually my main screen here. And we have released today the state of ASPM 2024. I put a link in the chat box if you want to grab it and check it out. But basically, we've spent the last couple of months surveying 500 security professionals, including 200 CISOs and 200 AppSec directors, about what they're concerned about in terms of today's threat environment, specifically related to AppSec. And we got some really, really great information here. We talk about blind spots that CISOs are concerned about. We talk about tool sprawl and how you can better build cooperation between developers and security teams to make things more efficient. It's really interesting. Some of the information that we came on was about how people felt about attack surfaces. And, we had a huge amount of people feel that today's attack surface is really, really unmanageable, 71% in fact. And if you looked at the CISOs specifically, that number jumped up to almost 80%. So again, AppSec, it's a problem, and that's why we're here to talk about. But if you'd like to jump into some interesting numbers and data from some research we did, please feel free to click on that link and download the report. Okay, so now I am back to Jamie and James, and would love to, first of all, one of the stats, I'm going to set the scene using some of the data that we got from the report. One of the stats, right, that I just spoke about was this idea that the attack surface is unmanageable. So I'd love to hear from, the two of you who are in the field and living it every day. James, we'll start with you. What do you think about the attack surfaces today? Are they unmanageable? What sort of tools or techniques do you use to tame them?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is just a natural outcome of the pros and cons of the cloud proliferation, where developers, all they need is a CTO's credit card and they can get off and running, spinning up new attack surface wherever they want to go. And so security teams are just playing catch up, which is why it feels unmanageable, because traditionally they were very wed to the infrastructure team, right? Like if you wanted a new DNS entry as a dev, you couldn't just go do that. You had to go through your sysadmins, your sys engineers, your network team, and there was a big process to add anything new to the application. But now devs have direct access a lot of the times to like Route 53 DNS in Amazon, and so they can really spin up more attack surface wherever they want, whenever they want. And so there's simultaneously a need to be proactive in setting guardrails that are sensible alongside reactive and figuring out what you have there. And so some techniques that I've seen is, I mean, there's a lot of different tool-based approaches, process-based approaches, a lot of tools that are like looking for your entire API endpoint scanning, a lot of tools that are looking at your DNS entries, and then a lot of process stuff like setting up infrastructure as code guardrails, locking down IAM access to Route 53. It really just requires a level of discipline and technical insight that a lot of security teams have to reforge new relationships, leaving behind some of the infrastructure on-prem relationships and making new ones that are closer on the developer and DevOps side.
Okay, so Jamie, you are, head of AppSec for a company. I just want to mention theScore actually is powering ASPM Bet. So, for those of you who have seen this all the ads on TV, Jamie is the man behind making sure it's all secure. So, to James' point, how you're on the other side of the coin. How do you promote this collaboration and make sure that you're covering all those attack surfaces?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely difficult, and I would agree with what James said, right? Environments are more dynamic in nature, and in those environments, the components are, I would say, they're more involved in APIs, third-party integrations, and dependencies. So, the key really is to start fostering that culture of security as early as possible, and working with teams to sort of treat it hand in hand as an approach, and that's really the way that you can get insights and manage or try to manage sort of this chaos that is coming from this sort of environment.
Yeah, something that you reminded me of that I'd like to add as well is that I know a lot of people, if you're like me, like the gut reaction from historical is like, I have to figure this out at runtime by like implementing CSPM type tooling that's going to like scan my runtime infrastructure and figure it out. But then over time, your security team realizes that this is all actually defined as code, and where I really need to be paying attention is the GitHub repo and not like the runtime piece. And so that's, I think, a huge component of getting a wrangle on this is like, where is your API gateway defining your endpoints, and like watch that file, as opposed to trying to like DNS scan all of your stuff at runtime and be reactive after the fact.
Okay, so application security is where we should be focused. And you can look at where a lot of the attacks are coming in. They're coming in at that application layer. So I think that's really good advice. Jamie, in terms of the attack surfaces, do you feel that they've grown, that they become unmanageable, or do you feel like you've got a good handle on them?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it seems like every day there's a new tool, a new way of doing things, and right now, serverless containers, deployment methodologies, red, blue, and blue, green, like they're. Next week there's going to be something new. So right now, in terms of at theScore, I think we have a good idea, a good grasp as to what's happening in our pipelines and where things are and what they're deployed. And it's really just making sure that we continue to get good data and insights into what's running. But again, next week there might be a new latest and greatest, and then that'll all change again. So.
I think that brings up a really good point, right? Like there's always the latest and greatest, there's the next new thing. And what we've done traditionally in AppSec is to adopt point solutions to kind of solve individual problems. And we've seen from our research in the state of ASPM that gaps in visibility because of too many tools is one of the top 2 concerns among AppSec professionals, right? This visibility problem. Do you feel, and Jamie, we can start with you because you brought this up, but do you feel that the point solution is in tool sprawl, is that hurting the problem? Is it making it better?
I actually think tool sprawl, I think, is a concern, but I think the bigger concern to me is what to do with the data that the tools output. For me, developers, they're the experts on the language they code in. It would be impossible. Those I would love it to hire someone who's an expert in all languages. But really the devs know the tools that provide them the most value. And so because of that, you get a lot of people with different opinions, different technologies, but they all output data. So tool sprawl is a concern if you're not sure what to do with the output that they produce. Really for me, the problem to solve is, how can we leverage that data in a useful way?
James, any insights on how to, well, first of all, do you agree that you need to leverage data, that it's about the data? And if so, how do you do that? Any insights for you?
Yeah, I think tool sprawl, instead of hurting visibility, it's like a function of, I think security teams for too long at this point have been primarily driven in their assessment by how am I getting visibility into this particular thing? And so that's going to be like a lot of different companies use like Elixir, right? It's like a semi-popular programming language, but it's not so popular that like most of the big SaaS SCA providers are going to like have a Elixir module. It's like more rare. And so that's an example where you would want like a point solution for that just to get visibility into it. But really, the main problem of all of this, as Jamie was saying, is like doing something with the data, or else it just sits there kind of meaninglessly. And so it's definitely more about how do you create outcomes out of the scanners instead of just being this thing that sits there. And the other thing with tool sprawl within AppSec that I found is it's a uniquely enterprise problem because of DevOps, where you have a lot of very mature teams who care about security and have like found their own security solutions and scanners that they're putting in their pipelines. And so you need the flexibility to adapt to that in an enterprise. But for smaller, more mid-market companies, I think it's less a tool sprawl problem and more of like they're not doing any scanning at all. And so you have this really interesting, like for enterprise, they have too many tools. And then for mid-market, there's 0 tools. And so it creates, this is why I think the most successful providers within ASPM both have their own options available for people or can point them towards open source ones that work, but then also integrate with to serve enterprise customers that are going to be bringing their own, tons and tons of scanners to the table.
It's almost like an all or nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we all three of us agree that not scanning is worse than having too many tools, right? I mean, is there anybody who wants to take that point that we don't need to scan anything?
I just love doing devil's advocate stuff. The only thing I can think of is that it might actually make you more outcome driven. Like if you do no security scanning, but you do an annual meaningful pen test engagement or like a tabletop, that might get better outcomes than a million scanning tools that you're just like sitting there looking at all these vulnerabilities that don't actually matter.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting. I'm gonna poke a little further there. Annually, I mean, we're releasing software weekly, daily, hourly. Is an annual pen test enough?
It's not, I mean, I don't think either. I was more just making the point that if you're a mid-market company, it might, and you don't have the budget or the buy-in to implement a tooling like this, it's more just that like that hands-on engagement time can be more meaningful than drowning in this sea of alerts that no one's looking at anyways. Because I think just what happens is that so many of these findings are false positives that you can really just almost instantly make developers stop paying attention to it if you're not really careful about how you do the rollout, is you are training them within minutes to ignore everything that a scanner is saying.
Yeah, I see Jamie nodding his head like vigorously here. So
yeah,
it's with you.
False positives are a problem, and I think it gives a lot of security teams a bad rap, or the tooling doesn't paint security teams in a positive light because everything is on fire according to a lot of security tools. But I think the key there is to get ahead of that and have the flexibility to move quick on what fires and what doesn't fire. But yeah, if you're drowning in noise, right, like where do you start? But if you have, like an AppSec team that's overseeing, policies and overseeing what tools are triggering and can sort of get that, what I would call cruff, out of the way early, then, and you teach people that, then it can lead to a more positive outcome for the business.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to being smart with the data, which, Jamie, I've heard you say a number of times, right? So can you talk a little bit more about what does it mean to be smart with the data?
Yeah, so I mean, the being smart with your data to me is context. It's context and what the data is relevant to. So if I look at a scanner that's producing findings, but say it's producing findings for an application that's in an isolated environment, I might not care as much about some of the findings that are in there, given the context that it's in an isolated environment, or maybe it's not a publicly facing resource, right? So to me, being smarter with my data, being smart with data in general, is to contextualize it. And I don't think that that's a problem that's easily solved. I think that's where the human element comes in and is needed right now to help contextualize the findings.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, James, back to your point of playing a little devil's advocate, right? If you're scanning and doing nothing with your findings, then you might as well just not scan at all, right? I think that's kind of where you,
Yeah,
correct me, is that's sort of what you're saying,
no,
right?
that's exactly. I mean, whenever I want to stir the pot on LinkedIn, I'll just talk about how, like, if your scanning is not leading to an outcome, it's entirely pointless. But the hard part of what Jamie said is exactly, like, I talk to so many vendors who are building they try to pitch like this silver bullet to prioritization, like, we do this runtime thing, or we do this API scanning context thing, and like, the amount of actual context you need is really, really challenging, which is why at the end of the day, most of these like vuln management services like end up doing a ton of white glove stuff to really make it even work for your business. Because for just to use PagerDuty as an example, like, we're FedRAMP in process, and so there is no vuln that we get to not treat seriously or not remediate. Like, we have to justify and fix every single thing no matter what. And so what we would want from a vuln prioritization tool is extremely different than what most other companies would want. And same with those other companies, they have their own prioritization desires, whether it's like, we use this service for authentication and it is the single most important service in our application, or you just outsource your auth service to a SaaS provider and you don't care at all about the services that are handling it. And so it's just really really varies heavily based on a lot of context that's both in the code, outside of the code, at runtime, not in runtime. So it's really a huge difficulty to prioritize, which is why I try to focus on what's the tool that's going to make it so developers actually enjoy fixing things as much as humanly possible, instead of what tool is going to help me figure out, the top 10 vulns of the quarter for them to fix, because that's just not a velocity of remediation that's going to make any progress.
So what are those tools? I mean, give us, you're on the developer side. How do we make them, how do we engage developers?
Yeah, I think I honestly, I focus a lot on the container vulnerability side, because I think it's the biggest gap in the industry as far as like helping you. The thing that no one does is, because every tool will say like, there's a vulnerability in this Linux package dependency, and they'll say the fix is to run yum update Linux dependency. But if you're building a Docker image, like, you don't want to just have this crazy Docker file full of bespoke like yum updates on specific packages or whatever. Like, the real answer might just be update your base image. Maybe you need to move to a new version. Maybe you just need to rebuild the image and redeploy, and it'll fix it as part of that. There's not a lot of like contextual scanning happening. And this is especially the most on container vulns and the SCA side. On the secrets side, it's more about the remediation workflow of like, the hardest part of fixing a secret is rotating the secret. It's not discovering that a secret was leaked. And so anything that helps with the key rotation, with the cleanup of the commit history, like, those are the hard parts. And on the SaaS side, that's where it's a little bit more like, a lot of people at this point are just plugging in, ask OpenAI how do I fix this SaaS thing, and then it gives you the fix. And so that's where I see the most like one-to-one fixes available. But for the other things, I just wish that the workflows were more built around how do I get this fixed instead of how many filters can I put on a dashboard to get the top 5 vulns that I need to find.
Okay, so I mean, it's a really interesting take. And I think the FedRAMP for PagerDuty that gives you an extra layer of complexity. You've got to fix everything. So how do you prevent, and we can start with maybe you, Jamie, but how do you prevent security from being a blocker, and how do you make sure that you are shipping that good code fast?
Yeah, I feel like there's a million ways you can answer that question, and probably none of them would ever be viewed as right, but I'll give it my best.
Sure.
I mean, to use a buzzword, shift left, it's a super commonly thrown around, but I mean, and I think that shift left would change depending on the company you worked at or went to. But I mean, you want to implement security as early as possible. It's such a common thing, a common saying, but at the end of the day, right, the code is being written by large by people. And so there's a human element to this that I think it needs to be addressed, in that, you don't want to block people. And security, I think, has been looked at as a blocker for a long time. And I think the shift that we're seeing in recent times is that, security teams are working to make security a part of the culture. Almost, you see some companies gamifying it. And I think if you approach it that way, if you approach it as more of a human to human interaction, you're like, hey, I like the code you're writing, but hey, maybe have you thought about writing it this way? It could, save you from pain from this later, or this might be a more secure way to write this method or function that you've written, right? I think really, having that level-headed mindset between security and development, that you're on the same team, you're on the same page, and you're here to help, is really what will help change things at the core. And when you have that mindset in place, and you sort of have that understanding that security teams are here to help, then I think that as things progress and as code goes from concept to fingers on keyboard to out to production, I think that's where you'll start to see a more proactive change, or a mindset that is writing secure code from the get-go.
Yep.
James, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I really have, what stuck with me is I did a webinar with Scott Gerlash at Stackhawk, and he separates how to shift left into people, processes, and tools. And I think that breakdown is so on point, because you really need all 3 to do this properly, where like the people to people relationship, and I define that with, like, if you're a security person, push one piece of code into production, like it doesn't matter if you're changing the color of a button, like whatever, just to build the relationships along the way, because like you're going to have issues come up and you're going to deal with this, like, why is this so hard? And then everybody will be like, oh, we've been complaining about this for years and whatever. And like, so you'll build the relationships through that. And then on the process side, I think getting security, and there's a real opportunity to do this with infrastructure early in the process, where because infrastructure usually has the same complaints as security does, as far as like, all of a sudden the devs they built 15 different AI models they're using, and we don't know where to host it or what they want. And then all of a sudden they're being asked to stand up some scalable AI system. And then security is in that same boat of like, where are we sending the data? What data are we sending? And like, you have the same concerns. And so I think there's an opportunity to get into design early with infrastructure as partners. And the way that I've looked at is that like, maybe 50% of the time that means a meeting you're going to be in that you have no value in, because it's like some meeting about changing some front end flow that like, who cares from a security perspective. But it means that the other 50% of the time you'll be discovering very early, like, hey, can we just add a metadata tag on the PII we're storing there? And then you've just saved yourself like so much work later in the process, just by being in that meeting to say the one sentence very early on to prevent like a giant breakdown. And then finally, the tooling is where we always go first, but it does really matter ultimately. Like, I don't think you can do this with, I just remember I had so many problems with different tools that I've used that are more the legacy providers that existed before the cloud stuff. And it makes your job just way harder when you're dealing with, a lot of times it's, why is this so hard to use this tool? The answer is because the tool is really old and was not built with this thing in mind. And so I think it does matter to not be afraid to switch tools, to try new things, to implement things to help speed up and categorize and do all of that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think what I'm hearing from both of you is that it's not just a, James, you just said it, it's not just a tool, it's a problem. It's a human problem. It's a process problem. In terms of like the human side of it, right? Developers are usually kind of evaluated on their ability to get out new features fast. Do we need to switch that model and start, you know, looking at security? Like, does that need to be part of their deliverable? James, what's your thought?
Well,
Like, does that need to be part of like their bonus structure, or how they're evaluated annually is like, you know, shipping secure code?
My background is in startups, and I'm like newer to security, and so my gut reaction is always like a DevOps reaction, which is like, no, like absolutely not. Security should not be a part of the evaluation, because it's important to be realistic. I think as a security professional, like, you have to realistically assess how much does security matter for your application. And so like that's at PagerDuty, it is incredibly important to us because of the role that we play in customer environments, because of FedRAMP. And so like for us, absolutely, developers are expected to own security very fundamentally. It's part of assessments. It's everything. You know, it matters a lot to us. But you have to just be realistic about. I've worked at some places where like it should not. The fact that we had a small security team, like that made sense because security was not as directly tied to revenue. If we had a breach, like maybe it certainly wouldn't be good, but it wouldn't be like the end of the world as far as like it would, you know, depending on the data that we're collecting, like if it's very non-sensitive, you have to be realistic about the stage of the company that you're at and what kind of data are you collecting from people, and then allow that to guide how much of your dev time you can invest into security.
So Jamie, you're handling a lot of sensitive data, a lot of PII, payment data. What's your take? Do you agree with James, or do you think like, you know, developers need to be responsible for writing clean code?
I think, you know, for me, I agree. I agree with James to a sense, right? Like I you know was in DevOps for a long time, and it was always frustrating when security swooped in and was sort of like, oh, this doesn't get shipped no matter what. And we're like, well, we need to deliver by this date, and the company wants it, right? So for I think it goes back to sort of context, like what is the company's appetite for risk? And who makes that decision, right? So for myself, I think developers should be aware of security issues for their particular language or project they're working on. The tooling and getting that in front of them as early as possible are good indicators, and gets it in front of them so they're at least, you know, they're somewhat thinking about it. I think putting the sole responsibility of having them manage it and maintain it on their own, I don't know that that would be effective entirely, just because it's like DevOps is so huge in scope, AppSec is so huge in scope, right? Like I think having a team dedicated to sort of looking at it through that lens, and working hand in hand with development teams is the best solution. But having a team sort of go off on their own and manage security on their own, I think you're eventually asking for trouble.
Okay, so it's something that we here at Psycho talk about a lot, is about security being a team sport, that we really need to work across DevOps, DevSecOps, and development to make sure that we're all, and security obviously, but to make sure that we're all, you know, doing the best that we can. So yeah, so interesting.
Sorry, you reminded me of something to add is I really think that product should be the one that is assessed and owns it more than security, or more than developers, as far as like they're the ones who have to make the risk decision based on the context of like, is the company going to go under if this feature doesn't ship that has some security issue or not? Like that's why I think primarily it should be an assessment on the product team that's guiding developer work more than on the devs themselves, because they're just doing the tickets that are assigned to them to do. And so if you just make it kind of DevOpsy, where it's like DevOps at a lot of organizations was implemented in terms of like congratulations, developer, now you have this extra thing to do that no one's going to help you with or tell you what to do. And if security is done sort of the same way, and it's like now your bonus structure is like tied to this extra thing that you just are expected to do, that's where I think it would be difficult. But I do think product should absolutely be held to the standard of like, if they're making a risk acceptance, like that's on them to do.
I think that's a hot take. I'm really interested in that. I've never heard anybody say that product should make the call. Jamie, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with James. I think I mean product is they're driving sort of that direction, right? Like they're helping drive the product, and you know if a security issue is raised, then that needs to be worked into their planning. If it's not something that they're willing to account time for or to consider, then the onus is on them to evaluate that, accept the risk, and you know move forward with it. At minimum, at least what I think people in security strive to aim for, you know, when we're not a blocker is the sort of idea of tech debt and going back after the fact and making fixes. So, you know, I think risk acceptance is important in the sense that, you know, we have a deliverable that needs to go out. We need to have it go out, but there should be some sort of compensating control to protect the product, or some planned work to go back and you know remediate those things if possible.
Okay, super interesting. All right, I'm going to just pivot a little bit, and I'm going to bring back in one of the findings that we found when we did our research into our State of ASPM 2020 report. And that is that 90% of the people that we surveyed, and just as a reminder, it was 500 security professionals, 90% of them said that they would consider consolidating their AppSec tools on, which actually I think it was 88% said that they were planning on doing some consolidation in the next 12 months, and 90% said that they would consider consolidating onto a single platform. You know, is this the way? Like we've seen, you know, this happen with CSPM. Is ASPM the way for application security? And Jamie, you're using an ASPM platform, so I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, I always like to make the sort of database driven decisions. And for me, I think consolidating, or I guess my opinion, not just for me, but you know, consolidating your data to a central place is key here. So you know, for you know, again, going back to tool sprawl and things like that, you know, I don't want to be in a position where I'm telling developers what tools they should or shouldn't use. You know, for what theScore does and how I've implemented or been implementing application security here is I want to have a solid foundation where I know what to expect, or I know what sort of things are happening for sure. But then the tools that developers choose, I care more about that data getting back to a central spot so it can be correlated. So I think consolidation of the AppSec tools as the tool themselves maybe isn't as important to me as it is to make sure that the data that the tools are generating get back to a central place so that data can be used in a meaningful way.
So consolidation of data is where you're
consolidation of data, yeah, and it could be a single tool that accepts all that data, or is, you know, taking the data and correlating it. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, having that data together and being used in a way that can, you know, help you identify different risks and contextualize it more is where the value is.
Okay, James, is it about consolidating tools, consolidating data, context?
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly a question that every venture capitalist would love an answer to, as far as like where to invest in, because I talk to a lot of companies. There's this thin line that exists between ASPM and vulnerability remediation platforms, which isn't like a Gartner category, but like that's what I think they are. Is like fundamentally, if you don't do any of your own scanning, you exist as a data warehouse for vulnerabilities and asset management. And like you provide ways like what Jamie is saying of surfacing that data. On the other hand, with market pressures, like CISOs definitely want consolidation as far as like They don't want to spin up new contracts with 30 other vendors. Like everyone's experiencing that buying tools is harder than ever now. Like it no longer is there some security engineer with like a CTO credit card that they can just go and give someone and start buying tools. And so there is a heavy pressure towards consolidation. And so the $billion question is like, what happens if one of the big CNAP providers gets into this space, or what happens when ASPM starts getting more runtime configuration scanning? Do you want one tool that both does the scanning and does the reporting? Or are there always going to be multiple scanning tools, and you'll always need like a vulnerability remediation platform? And that's why I think companies that can handle both are in the best position to succeed, because there's been times that I can think of companies I've been at where I would have zero interest in a vulnerability remediation platform because everything is so streamlined that I can guarantee, like, one tool I can think of would fit 90%, 95+% of our scanning. We want that all in one. But I've been at other places, and I think this is especially true of enterprises, where like that's just not realistic. Like you're never going to have one security tool, and so it does make sense to have sort of that vuln platform that's more holistic. And so I do think ultimately there's room for both, and for both to be considered as consolidation. Because I think effectively what we're talking about with all these tools is configuration scanning, whether it's at runtime or the code, like that's what it is. And so it makes sense that you have a single place to look at your configuration scanning alerts. But the other thing I want to say is that since you made the comparison to CSPM, I think what's going to happen here is what people really want is sort of like how CSPM became CNAP, and CNAP is getting more and more like cloud detection response, like runtimey, because like the vulns you can't keep up with, and so you want that runtime protection more. I think in really long term with AppSec, what we'll have is I think RASP, or runtime application security protection, is a giant gap in the industry right now that there's very few people doing. And I think that that's going to be, once we get a better handle on this configuration stuff, there's going to be a real need out there to instrument things like, how do you kill a user session if you see SQL injection attempts coming in? If you see cross-site scripting attacks coming in, can you block the IP from where you're seeing that come in? Those sorts of like runtimey detections, I think, are really going to be the 10-year opportunity for AppSec.
Interesting. So, you know, I've talked to a number of CISOs along the way as part of my daily job, and to understand the market and trends. And one of the things that I have consistently heard is that it's very difficult to add another headcount to the department, and it's slightly easier to add another tool. So I guess I'm trying to set the stage of saying, like, our AppSec teams aren't going to grow to big enough to manage a lot of tools. And we found when we surveyed our 500 people for the state of ASPM 2024 that we wanted to know how big their AppSec teams were. And we did not survey one company that had more than 10 people. And in fact, most of the AppSec teams we had were around 4 to 5 people. So they're really small teams. So, how much, what's the tension between, balancing your budget or meeting your budget constraints, right? We know they're not growing every year, versus, having people to manage your tools. Like, is that, Jamie, is that a consideration? Like, you only have a certain amount of people. You can't manage 20 different tools. So I guess my question here is, what's the trade-off between, what you can do with your staff versus tooling, and how does budget pressures fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it comes down again to a company's appetite for risk, and how important security is to them, and how they want to integrate, right? Certainly, I would say not just AppSec, but even if you look at DevOps teams, traditionally they've been smaller because they've been allowed to automate, and so I think, if a team is given enough time to implement it, and automate things as much as possible, then you have the benefit of team sizes remaining smaller. But if you're onboarding tools faster than you can manage, then that's an issue that's a people problem. Like you don't have enough people to manage the tooling in a sustainable way. So for myself, and the way I manage my team, I give them as much time as makes sense to automate things that normally would be done by hand or require a longer drawn out process if we're what I call click ops, if we were to click through and set things up, right? So I think because of that, you might see that team sizes, if done properly, you might see AppSec teams continue to remain smaller, but then that might mean that your budget for tooling is a little bit more, right? And with the right tooling, depending on your use case or your needs, you can get a lot of automations from that. But yeah, ultimately, I think this would come back to sort of a mindset or a thought process on how these teams operate. And definitely, I like to borrow from the DevOps mentality. Automate as much as you can.
Yeah, definitely automation is good and the key to saving some significant time and resources. So Jamie, you're working with SciCode right now, and you're a relatively newer customer. I don't want to say you're new because you're not, but when you were going about sort of looking at the problems you were trying to address, how much did working with a single platform give you peace of mind into closing visibility gaps, and maybe working with a platform saved you some licensing fees of having multiple point solutions? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, the human part of this is really important, right? So to give some context, when I came in at theScore, AppSec there was a need for it. Shlomo Bilak, the VP there, he identified that there was a gap and we needed AppSec. And so coming in to a company that has been around for well over 10 years, and then to go and implement an AppSec program is daunting. Visibility is difficult, and ramping up on how things have been done for that long and where things are is challenging. So for me, working with SciCode and looking at SciCode, it allowed me to gain visibility into all of those things. There's only so much time in a day for you to dig in and learn these processes and sort of tribal habits, if you will. And so if I look at it from that perspective, again, gathering data and having that single pane of glass view, SciCode was excellent for that. And as the team grows and I brought in people in, it's easier for me to say, okay, here's one of our products. Here's how you can find it in SciCode, and the data is there to tell me, or to tell the engineer, the AppSec engineer, here's where the code lives in a repository. Here's the SDLC, the tools involved in it, and eventually say it's containerized and now running in Kubernetes. Having that single pane of glass and being able to connect those dots is great, just to learn a company's assets and how they interact with each other. And that single pane of glass just makes it that much easier. So in that context, it allows us to quickly gain a bigger picture of sort of the landscape, which helps us ultimately assess risk when we're looking at vulnerability data.
Great. And then just a follow-up question on that. I know that you assessed a number of different vendors, and you talk a lot about being smart with the data. Can you maybe give some insight into how SciCode has helped you be smart with the data? Because that data is like the theme of the day. I think James has mentioned it. You've mentioned it a number of times. So how are we smart with the data?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give you a good example here, right? Is theScore operates in two of the major clouds, AWS and GCP, right? So to come in, after years and years of development and having a heavily containerized environment, and assessing the landscape, what vulnerabilities do we have in our containers, how bad are they, that sort of thing, is one. But for me to be able to look at SciCode and say, okay, now show me containers with the worst vulnerability, show me the highest number. Let's just pick a numbers game. We'll ignore severity. Take those containers. Now show me the ones that are running in production. Those are the ones I care about, right? You might have a container sitting in a registry that is old or not used, or it's not running currently. Having the ability to, again, contextualize it and say, here's something with vulnerabilities, and it's actually running here in a Kubernetes cluster. Being able to have that mapping is super important. And then also, if we want to look at AppSec as working hand in hand with development teams, the ability for us to actually proactively go and try and fix those things, right? So, recently we've had some work done where, and I encourage my AppSec engineers to do this, is when we're looking at that bigger picture, if you see something that you think you can fix, then open a PR, right? Like if it's low hanging fruit, do the work. And so with SciCode, I can see what's in prod. I can, get it from that initial query of saying, show me my containers that are, the highest vulnerability count that are running in prod, but also show me what repo stores that Docker file. So really you're getting that full path, right? To here's the code, creates this container running in production. That sort of context and connecting the dots with data saves a lot of time and takes a lot of pressure off security practitioners and gets them to focus more on fixing the issue rather than discovering things.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really nice explanation. Okay, so we're sort of winding up to the top of the hour. It is the end of the year. We love to talk about predictions going forward. James, I'm going to start with you. What do you see is the future of AppSec? What do we have to look forward in 2024 and even beyond? Where are we going? Or even where should we be going? Maybe that's the better question.
Yeah, I'm deciding between two hot takes. I think the one I'm gonna go with is like generative AI is super, like not in like any of the buzzwordy consolidate whatever stuff, but like the companies that provide scanning should be very intimidated by what it can do. So like I just open source something I built in like a day that was like just send your code to OpenAI and it gives back the vuln findings, and like those findings are more applicable, more clear, more fixable than multi-billion-dollar companies who have invested all this money into their own complicated scanning mechanisms, regexes, databases, like all this stuff they're doing to try to do code analysis. And just this thing I built in a day has provided more useful output to some of my own projects than some of those bigger providers. And so I think that it's really frightening and exciting for practitioners who don't have to worry about the like what vendor's gonna come out ahead thing. What it can do with so little time, and the hard part is just making it like more scalable, consistent results, getting it dashboarded. But that stuff like you can figure out pretty easily. Just the raw power of like vulnerability contextualization using Gen AI stuff is pretty incredible what someone can make in like a day, as opposed to needing $10 million from a VC to go do something. So.
All right, Jamie, over to you. What's your prediction for next year and beyond?
Yeah, I think next year and beyond for sure. Generative AI is huge. I mean, it's a benefit to security practitioners as much as it is to baddies who are causing us headaches. I mean, the tools are available to both sides, so that's going to be a huge one. Definitely, I think we'll see a tighter integration with DevSecOps and those practices. And then, as things continue to go more serverless, things move cloud native, API security, different threat intelligence integrations, threat modeling and monitoring and compliance and regulatory and open source licensing. I think all those things are just going to keep amping up higher and higher, and AppSec's purview is going to grow wider and wider. I think in the future you might see that there's another sort team like AppSec that starts to be a sublet that starts to handle specific areas of AppSec, because AppSec itself is growing so huge, and there's so much purview under its site that I think we're going to see a boom there, and as well as some sort of sub teams under that make up pieces of AppSec to continue to handle that sort of the rippling effect of different pieces of it.
Yeah, interesting. So in one of the findings in our state of 2024 ASPM, State of ASPM report that was just released today, we asked CISOs and AppSec directors, what are your biggest concerns going forward? And we were really surprised. Gen AI was number 2, so that tracks, but number 1 was still software supply chain security. It edged it out. So I'm just sharing that because I think it's interesting. Like we're really, again, still concerned about that, but Gen AI is quick on its heels, and I'm sure 2024 will bring a lot more new and novel ways to use and abuse Gen AI in AppSec and development. So, so that is. Oh yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just, I mean, the AI solution, it also has the supply chain vulnerabilities with it. So like the PyTorch vuln that came out, like it's the same. Yeah, so I guess supply chain has to remain more fundamental.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting lesson.
A lot of companies are afraid to be in the news. I think everyone is afraid of a SolarWinds-like attack, or at some of those breaches that have happened. And I think it's important, but there's a lot of other caveats that play into something like that happening.
Well, and especially when you see the liability like shifting to personal players in the security team, right? I mean, that has got to terrify every CISO we know out there. When you see Uber, I mean, that was a slightly different thing, but SolarWinds, there's litigation against them. So yeah, definitely a big scary world out there if you let it in terms of AppSec. So I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. I have enjoyed speaking with both of you immensely, and it's a really great conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us, and really, I value your expertise, your time, and most importantly, the insights you've shared today. Just as a reminder, the full State of ASPM 2024 research report, you can head over to psycho.com to find it, or you can click on the link in our chat window here. So that is it for this week. Our next episode will be launching in January in the new year. We'll have some new things to think about and worry about. But for today, thank you very much for attending, and thank you guys for your time. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Julie.
Bye.